Science is under attack from our culture's dominant tribes. Ask one, and they'll tell you that science is a Western prejudice, no better than literal indigenous witch doctory. Ask the other, and they'll tell you that science is a secular prejudice, no better than their witch doctory, which they cynically call creation science. What makes science better than witch doctory, than superstition, than religion? In her essay for The New Intellectual, Ayn Rand connects science's objectivity to induction. The scientist starts with experience, evidence, categorizes the phenomenon, conceptualizes it, and forms generalizations to find the deep causes operating in the world. Not many think of science this way, at least not anymore. The way science works, for example, according to Richard Feynman, is that first the scientist guesses about the nature of the world. Then they test their guess, and if their guess doesn't pass the test, they start over with another guess. That's the scientific method I kind of got from high school, to the extent that we got anything. It was, you have some kind of hypothesis, and where does it come from? It doesn't matter. You test it. If you ask scientists today to explain the methods of science, to defend their craft against superstitions, religion, why is it better? Why is it more rational than superstitious prejudice? They'll give you some version of this view of science. And additionally, they'll tell you that one of the features that makes science so much better than religious superstition, witch doctory, is that science is never fully certain of its findings. Science is always open to new evidence which might completely upend everything we think we know. Our best theories probably aren't really true. In the future, we'll have better theories, which are very different from today's theories, and presumably in the future's future, they'll have even better ones. That way of thinking, this whole way of thinking, has its roots in the Austrian-born 20th century philosopher of science, Karl Popper. Popper spent most of his career at the London School of Economics in England, but his original work he did in German in Austria. He's very influential not just on scientists, but on how large parts of our culture's tribes think about politics. So he's the author of a book defending Western democracies against Marxism and authoritarianism called The Open Society and Its Enemies. This was a book that was popular with some kind of Hayekian types. He was friends with Hayek, dedicated a book to Hayek. Also popular with some left-wing types. If you've heard of George Soros and his Open Society Foundation, that's where the name comes from Karl Popper's book. So left and right, there's a lot of love for Popper. There's also this interest in Popper from people in the sciences, and there's a kind of renegade group of figures in the culture who don't want to identify as left or right. Sometimes they call themselves moderates or dark web or rationalists, is a word some of them use. They're very Popperian too, a lot of them explicitly so. So there's a huge influence here. Now, Popper wrote, this is just a very short sampling of his works. He wrote widely in epistemology, philosophy of science. He wrote about free will, politics. He's a very wide-ranging thinker. Obviously, in 40 minutes, we can't learn everything there is to know about Popper. We're going to be narrowly focused on his views of scientific induction. Now, lucky for you, if you find all of this interesting, want to go deeper into Popper, you can take my ARU course in the fall on Popper. You won't get 40 minutes, you'll get 16 hours of him. So maybe 40 minutes isn't enough, but maybe 16 might be too much, but you'll have to tell me. So my focus today is on the validity of scientific induction, in particular, Popper's rejection of it and his alternative to it. And my thesis is that Popper's protestations to the contrary notwithstanding, his rejection of induction and his falsificationism, which is what he names his alternative, play right into the witch doctor's hands. Popper's philosophy fails to explain or defend the rationality of science and opens the door to arbitrary speculation. He's an enemy of science, not an ally. So, what's today's agenda? We're going to talk about induction, and we're going to do that by looking at kind of two, I think of them as like two phases to Popper's thought on induction. So in his early days, in his book, The Logic of Scientific Discovery, that's from 1934, he gives an argument that induction could never be valid. It's not like we just don't understand it well enough to give principles of induction. It's that the whole thing is a dead end. So that's the first thing we'll talk about. Second, we'll talk about his later kind of philosophizing about induction. This is from the 1960s, 1963, his book Conjectures and Refutations. And that discussion I find much more interesting than the early one, but it presupposes the kind of thought that went into the early work. So we have to cover the early stuff to get to the more interesting stuff. What's more interesting about the second phase of Popper is that he's much more thinking about science as an active process, and he's thinking about the scientists, like how do they function and research. And he's thinking that, well, if they were really inductivists, that would in some way undermine what's special about science. So after we cover that, we'll talk about his alternative to induction, falsificationism. And as we go through all of this, I'm going to, of course, be giving some commentary responses. I'll try to tie all that together at the end, and how much I'll do will depend on how much time is left. But most of my what I have to say will come as we discuss Popper. So we're talking about induction. We're going to talk about the problem of induction. So the first thing to do is make sure we're all clear on what we're talking about. So induction is a word that objectivists throw around a lot. Objectivism is an inductive philosophy. There's several lectures by Leonard Peikoff with the word induction in it. What do we need to know about induction? What do we need to know about the so-called problem or problems of induction to understand Popper? Well, for our purposes, we can think of induction just as the method of inference from which we infer some general knowledge from less general knowledge, from which we infer all from some. Now, there's a lot more you could say, of course, but I think for our purposes, that's fine, this kind of first pass description. So what do I mean by a generalization? Well, if I have a farm with some chickens and I see that all my chickens reproduce by laying eggs, and I extrapolate that chickens as such, all chickens lay eggs, that's a generalization, all, right? All these things are like this. Now, induction is the process of going from some instances to all members of a group or a class. There's another method of inference called deduction, which goes in the opposite direction. So if I know that all the hens lay eggs and I get a new hen, I can, by just mechanical logic, know that this one does. So that's going in the opposite direction. Now, deduction is very well understood by philosophers, logicians, going all the way back to Aristotle. I mean, really, Aristotle and then footnotes, right? Induction, not so much. So when philosophers talk about induction, it's usually in the kind of context of, well, there's a problem of induction. Nobody knows whether induction is valid, whether it's the kind of method that reliably produces true conclusions given true inputs. No one knows what those methods are. There's the debates, different views. Some people think this whole thing is, like Popper, a waste of time. So there's a number of things that are sometimes called the problem of induction. So the first thing you might call the problem of induction is just the question, what principles of induction guarantee or maybe increase the likelihood that our conclusions are true when we're trying to generalize? Just that question. That's the question that, if you're familiar with Leonard Peikoff's work on induction, he's interested in. He wants to give you an account of what are the right rules, principles, methods of induction, and he also wants to talk about how we could prove them. The other issue that's often called the problem of induction is a sort of argument that concludes there's no possible answer to the above question. If you take a philosophy class, an undergraduate philosophy class, this is probably what you'll get as the problem of induction if it comes up. Sometimes this is associated with David Hume. Now, Popper's work is, in his early work, is concerned with this one here, like giving an argument that no answer to the first question is possible. So we're going to talk a little bit about both, and we're going to start with this one here. So I'm going to give you an argument from Popper. Really, it's my version of an argument from Popper. We're going to talk about its assumptions. I'm going to give a criticism of it. And I'm going to draw out from it what we need from it to understand why Popper is so hostile to induction, and then why the people who take Popper seriously, think of themselves as Popperians, are still retain this hostility. Okay. So this is, again, my version of early Popper's argument against induction. So, first premise. Induction is valid only if there are valid principles of induction. So what does that mean? Well, if we're talking about validating a whole entire method, what we're after is showing that that method will produce true conclusions from true inputs. So if your evidence, your data is good, follow this method and you'll arrive at the right generalizations. That's the idea of validating a method. And this premise takes it that the only way to do that is to find principles of induction, rules of induction that are like that are truth-preserving. So what would a principle of induction look like? Well, let's say I'm looking at I'm an ornithologist looking at birds, and I notice that all the birds I've surveyed reproduce with egg laying, that whole thing. And I think to myself, well, I mean, the birds I've seen are like this. I wonder if all birds are like this. I think that's a good inference from my cases to the claim that all birds lay eggs this way, because I've randomly sampled birds from around the world, and if you take a random sample of a population and it has a certain property, it's very likely or almost certain that the population as a whole have that property. That's like a general rule, right? It's a rule of induction. Sample randomly and extrapolate from your sample to the population. That would be a principle of induction. Okay? Another premise. All generalizations are arrived at through induction. So any item of knowledge you have that takes the form all X is Y, all chickens lay eggs, all birds lay eggs, anything of that form, that kind of knowledge, a generalization, is arrived at through the inductive process. This second premise is, as Popper understands it, a key premise for inductivism, the view that all knowledge is arrived at through induction. And that's really his target, inductivism, not just induction in particular. Now, all principles of inductions are themselves generalizations. They say every time you want to infer from some to all, follow this rule, and you'll get to the correct generalization. That's itself a general rule. It applies to all inferences of a certain type. So we have three premises. Induction is valid only if there are valid principles of induction. All generalizations are arrived at through induction. And all principles of induction are generalizations. Well, if those three premises are true, it follows that all principles of induction are arrived at inductively. Everybody kind of follow along the, we'll get to attack it later, but just follow along the kind of reasoning. Good. I see nodding heads. I hope you're genuinely nodding your head and not just doing it to please me. Okay. So, if you take the conclusion that all principles of induction are arrived at inductively, and you go back to that first premise, that induction is only valid if there are valid principles of induction, then you wind up thinking that any argument for a principle of induction must assume the validity of induction. In other words, he's saying, or he's concluding, that any attempt to validate, to establish a principle of induction as valid you'll wind up in a vicious circle trying to do it. It's circular reasoning. The validity of induction is a kind of vicious circle. It assumes the very thing it's trying to prove. And if you've heard of circular reasoning before, it's supposed to be really bad. It's like one of the worst things you can do. Right? The classic example we give in undergraduate philosophy is like, here's a circular argument. You should believe the Bible. You should believe in God because it says there's a God in the Bible. You should believe the Bible because God wrote it. Right? So you're assuming the very thing you're trying to prove. And that's what Popper's saying is going on here. The arguments in favor of induction are always going to be circular. Okay. So, there we go. So, actually, I regret the title of this slide because objectivism hasn't really talked about this before. So this is an objectivist's reply. So you're kind of getting my reply here. And I want to really stress, there's several things you could say. There's one I really want to stress, and that's going to be about the conclusion. I'm going to charge that the conclusion actually contains an equivocation. So here's the conclusion again. Right? Any argument for principle of induction must assume the validity of induction. I want to talk about what it means for an argument to assume something. So, in what ways can an argument assume something? Like, what does that mean? Well, so let me give you a really kind of simple argument. Say I have a friend, let's call him John, who's at OCON, and he's both very interested in philosophy and also very social. So I think to myself, I don't know where John is, but I know enough about John to know that either he's at a lecture or he's out socializing. So I go to Tal's lecture. Let's say it's one of these lectures that there's only one at a time, and he's not there. And I conclude that, well, he's out socializing, right? So I said either he's socializing or at the lecture. He's not at the lecture, so he's socializing. A very simple kind of bit of reasoning. What does that argument assume? Well, more explicitly, like the two things I said, right? The two premises. Either he's doing the lecture or he's socializing, and the other premise is that he's not at the lecture. Those are my assumptions, and I use those assumptions to kind of get my new conclusion, my new bit of knowledge. So that's one way you can assume, you can think of an argument assuming something. Now, there's another thing you might call an assumption to this argument that, you might call it, you could. And that's this. My reasoning in that example was good only because it followed a particular rule or pattern of reasoning, of logic. And that's either A or B, not A, therefore B. Any bit of reasoning that goes like that is going to be good, assuming A and B are true, right? Am I assuming that in reasoning about where my friend is? Well, not in the same way, maybe, but certainly not in the same. It's not a premise. It's not like part of the evidence that where John is is logic, is something about logic, right? The evidence for where John is my knowledge about John's preferences for OCON activities and where he currently is not, right? That's my evidence. That's the evidence for my conclusion. Now, am I assuming a principle of logic and reaching it? I mean, I might not even know these principles of logic. I mean, little kids can reason this way, and they don't know anything about logic. So in what way am I assuming the principle I'm using when I reason? If you want to call it an assumption, it's a kind of assumption you have to distinguish from assuming a premise. They're different things. So here's my reply. If assume means like use a process of, then there's not actually a circularity, not a vicious one. So here we go. Any argument for principle of induction must assume the validity of induction. Assume in the sense of, well, you have to use induction to validate inductive principles. Okay, I'm going to say that is not viciously circular. In fact, that's a feature of a good epistemology, that it should be self-validating. If you really think about what we're trying to do in defending induction or just doing epistemology generally. We're trying to give a universal description of how we get knowledge, right? So this is how knowledge is acquired, and then you give your theory. Well, but your theory itself is an item of knowledge, so if your theory is true, it damn well better apply to itself, right? This is how I get knowledge. My theory is an item of knowledge, so it has to apply to itself. There's really good material on this that people, and I say people, me included, definitely, miss in OPAR in the first section of the chapter on reason, chapter 5. So I don't think it's the part that doesn't have a title. It's just like that first little preamble. He talks about reason and reason being able to validate itself, and it's worth looking at. So there's not a vicious circularity in using a method of reason to validate itself. And let me further talk about this a little further. Think about how we arrive at good epistemological principles. Well, what we do, basically, is reflect on our own past episodes of successful thinking and successful thinking that we can see in other people. So you learn about how doctors reason, you read Sherlock Holmes, maybe see how he reasons, you learn some history of science, you reflect on your own past successes and think about how did I arrive at the right decision. And from those you try to explain what are the common features of these different patterns of reasoning that I and others use successfully, and you abstract from that to some general principle. Now, let's see here. So it's, like I was saying, it's a feature, not a bug, that an epistemological method like induction might be needed to validate itself. And I'm saying that's not viciously circular. Like, it can sound like it's circular, but it's not viciously so. And I think if you take a moment, and here I'm just going to say this, I can't give a full developed argument, but I think if you really think about why circular reasoning is fallacious, the reason we think that is that it comes up in a context where there's a large chain of evidence gathering and intermediate subsidiary inferences required to get to a conclusion. So my little John example is really contrived and artificial. It's a little toy that we use in philosophy class. Real reasoning, even real deductive reasoning, there's all kind of background assumptions and prior knowledge you have that comes to bear in different ways. And it's when you're in a process like that, you have to keep clear what's evidence and what's conclusion. And if when you're thinking about the way in which induction is assumed in an argument for the validity of induction, it's not like the validity of induction is a piece of evidence in favor of the validity of induction. It's not a premise in your reasoning to the conclusion. Now, there's here we go. Hitting the wrong button. Okay. So on the one hand, I said there's an equivocation in this conclusion. If assume means uses a process of induction to arrive at induction, then it's not circular. Now, on the other hand, if assume means is a premise of, then it's just not true. It's not true that the validity of induction is a premise in my reasoning to the validity of induction. If I start with a bunch of cases of good reasoning, Sherlock Holmes reasons this way, doctors reason that way, Newton reasoned this way, I reason that way, this all has the following in common. There's not a premise, there's not a piece of evidence there which says anything about logic or induction. Now, there's another reply you could give to this argument that I'm going to skip because I'm worried about time. But you can ask me about that in the Q&A, and that's, just so you know what to ask about, that's that premise 2 is false. But there's a particular reason why I'm not talking about that, besides time. Okay, so Popper thinks induction is circular because of that argument I just gave. He doesn't understand the distinction between assuming something as a premise and using it as a principle of reasoning. Those are two different things, and it's important if you want to do good epistemology to keep them separate. There's another issue that comes up in his early work that tells you a little bit about how he views perception that I want to just briefly mention. So in Popper's view and the view of a lot of philosophers, epistemologists of his day, perception contains within it theory. There's no such thing as things being like perceptually self-evident, the way objectivism might think about it, because even perception is already telling you making theoretical commitments. Your background assumptions, literal theories, prejudices can even in some cases they think shape the way the world looks to you. And I have an example of this. Again, you can ask me in the question period because I'm concerned about time and it's not essential. Just that illustrates the idea here. The idea is just that there's no theory-free, neutral thing, experience, perception, observation. All of that stuff already has theoretical content. Perception and experience tells you the world is a certain way. It doesn't give you the world neutrally. It doesn't present the world directly. Okay. So now if induction is circular, if perception really is, as they say, theory-laden, perception's telling you something about the world, not presenting it, perception's the sort of thing that can be wrong. You have to think of it literally as telling you something. So if a stranger tells you something, do you just take that for granted? No, you have to. If an expert tells you something, well, you might need to check that they're actually an expert, they know what they're talking about. You don't just take it on authority, right? And if perception's telling you something, if perception can be wrong, well, you shouldn't take it on authority. Okay. So why am I talking about perception? Because later Popper makes hay of being anti-dogmatic, and he thinks that inductivism, in particular the view that all knowledge begins with perception, is a form of dogmatism or authoritarianism. Why does he think that? Well, it has to do with this, like if you think perception contains theory, contains propositional content, is communicating, telling you the world is a certain way, not presenting it neutrally, but telling you it's a certain way, then yeah, perception's one source of information that's fallible just like any other. He charges the inductivist philosophies, and really he has in mind Bacon and Aristotle, with having a view that there's like a book of nature or the truth out there that just kind of writes itself on our minds. Now, I know Jim Lennox is here and he's also lecturing here. You can ask him about how this is ridiculously unjust to Aristotle and like way off base, but this is what Popper thinks, right? He thinks that Aristotelian inductivism, Baconian inductivism is just a view that reality writes itself on your mind. And why might you think that? Well, according to the inductivists, all knowledge begins with perceptual experience. But perceptual experience is like a source of testimony to you. So when you look out in the world, it just kind of like writes the truth onto you. That's what I think the idea is. In objectivist terminology, he's rejecting intrinsicist theories of knowledge. Now, the alternative to intrinsicism and dogmatism isn't subjectivism and skepticism, which is what Popper endorses. It's objectivism, and we'll come to that. But I think it is helpful if you're familiar with the idea of intrinsicism, that this is what I think he's saying. And he thinks the root of this intrinsicism is this foundationalism about experience, that all knowledge begins with experience, sense experience. He has this passage in Conjectures and Refutations where he compares the inductivist's reliance on experience to the medieval's reliance on the authority of the church or ancient texts. He thinks that Bacon and Descartes were right to reject the authority of the church, but he thinks the problem was the reliance on authority. And what they did was just replace, in the case of Bacon, experience, in the case of Descartes, like a priori intuition. They just replaced the church with experience. So it's just a new authority. Experience is like another kind of testimony or authority. It's just one amongst several fallible sources of information. The priest says this, the ancient texts say that, my experience and experiments say this. I have to consider everything, put it to a test. That's where we're going with this. So before we go on to Popper's alternative, I want to sort of emphasize something that might not be, you might not have noticed fully, but kind of got a sense of. He's really objecting to views of knowledge in which the knower is passive, just absorbing. Popper's whole positive philosophy is about the scientist as an active agent trying to do things in the world and know and figure it out. That's, I think, a lot of the appeal of Popper to people. So anybody who's involved in any way in discovering new things, in actually knowing things, like scientists, the idea that what they're doing is this passive reception is just ridiculous. It just doesn't, it's a complete non-starter. So if somebody can convince you that inductivism is a kind of like passive receptivity philosophy, then yeah, you're going to have a lot of aversion to that. David Deutsch, if you're familiar with him, has this kind of perspective. He's a Popperian. So, Popper's alternative. Induction's a non-starter. Induction's too dogmatic, too reliant on the authority of one source of information. What do we do? What's the, on the one hand, there's no induction. That's a dead end. But on the other hand, science actually seems to have something figured out, right? So he's not overtly anti-science. He wants to kind of understand, at least that's how he sees himself. What are they doing if they're not doing induction? And his answer is First, it doesn't really matter where claims to knowledge originate. The inductivists are all obsessed about reducing their ideas back to perception. So rationalists are trying to reduce their ideas back to some kind of internal, self-evident intuition. It doesn't matter where it comes from. What matters is what you do with anything you're considering might be knowledge. Science proceeds by offering hypotheses, conjectures. It makes bold conjectures, bold predictions about the way the world is, and then subjects them to tests, refutations. So that's the title of the book, Conjectures and Refutations. Right? You come up with some hypothesis, some conjecture. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It came to you in a fever dream, LSD, good research. It doesn't matter where it comes from. That's where it comes from is all psychology. It's not epistemology. So let me just give an example of how the kind of Popperians think about things. So after Newton shared his discoveries of gravity and motion with the world, this scientist Halley realized that he could use this new physics to predict the trajectory of a comet that had appeared. Like, you could use the astronomical data with the comet and project into the future how would this comet behave. And he realized it would return every 76 years. It's a Halley's Comet. And after some time, the comet comes back as predicted. What's your reaction? Is that a confirmation of Newton? At further evidence that Newton got it right? Yeah, if you're nodding your head, you're a bad Popperian. It's not. It's not new evidence. There's no new evidence. That's hypothetico-deductive philosophy. That's the idea that you can have a hypothesis, deduce its consequence, and then if the consequence check comes true, that's evidence in favor of the hypothesis. That's too inductive for Popper. That's saying that theories are supported by evidence. Like, you can make a case for them. That's too inductive. Theories aren't supported. They are refuted or not refuted. So how Popper would think about this is, look, there's this bold conjecture, the Newtonian philosophy, and it makes a prediction, the return of this comet. There's a test, right? We go, look, did the comet come back? After, it takes a while, but the comet comes back. It passes the test. Well, that means Newton hasn't been refuted yet. That's all that means. Now, you can imagine if the comet didn't come back, what would you say? Well, you could say that, oh, there's something wrong, Newton's wrong, some of the data was wrong. You could reject something, right? If your prediction doesn't come true, something went wrong. And you reject that thing that went wrong. So you can reject a scientific theory, or any hypothesis, not just limited to science. You can reject, you can prove that something's false, but never really that it's true. Science is scientific not because it makes an inductive case for its conclusions by gathering evidence and generalizing. Science is scientific because it subjects its theories to falsification, to tests which might refute them. You can't prove a theory true. You can prove it false, hence falsificationism. A good scientist makes precise theories or generates precise theories which generates precise predictions. If I come along and say, here's my theory, Jesus will return, that's not scientific. Why? Well, when will he return? How do I check that? Now, if I come and say, Jesus is going to return on March 25th, 2025 in Branson, Missouri, that's falsifiable. We can go and check. So I'm being scientific. Now, we reject a theory when it fails the test. So if we wait a year and go to Branson and look at all the new babies and none of them are Christ-like, then the theory is refuted But it doesn't matter where a theory comes from. So I have a new theory. He's going to come back in 2027. And that goes on and on forever. Now, here's another thing you can ask me about in the Q&A. You can ask about auxiliary hypotheses. That's a kind of mainstream philosophy objection to all of this. My objection is that this is just an invitation to the arbitrary. So, in order to make a prediction, you need to have a precisely formulated theory. That's fine. That's a sort of restriction on your hypotheses, right? You can't have the Jesus will come back someday hypothesis. But it's not much of a restriction. It's, at the stage of a conjecture, explicitly allowing anything your mind can consider. Falsified theories can always be modified to avoid a falsifying prediction. My theory, I just added a year. If you're in particle physics, you just move around the parameters until the next accelerator refutes you. You just keep tinkering. You can always change things. You can do this over and over again. There's no principle of limitation here. Now, some Popperians like to say that, well, here's like a rule. If your theory is refuted, you can't modify it just to avoid the refutation. Which, forgetting about falsificationism, yeah, there's kind of something to that, right? Like, if you just change your mind and you just change it slightly just so you can avoid some idiosyncratic objection, like, that's not really thinking about things. That's kind of like trying to avoid criticism. But how could Popper possibly defend a principle like that? Isn't that a generalization? Like, don't ad hoc change your theories? And how would you justify that? Aren't we kind of back in that inductive paradox of several slides ago where you have to assume what you're trying to prove in order to, yeah. So this whole thing is just an invitation to arbitrary speculation. And interestingly, a lot of, especially recent criticisms of string theory and particle physics amount to saying that they're just making things up to avoid experimental results, and they're not like actually doing science anymore. They're just making things up, moving around parameters. But they're being good Popperians, so I guess they're being scientific, right? So that's what I want to say about Popper, and I want to close with just a few quick thoughts about what it takes, like just reflect on what it actually take to fully give a defense of science, a defense of induction. So, and the first thing is there has to be an answer to this problem of induction. This is, if you go back for the new intellectual, this is one of the major failings of the Enlightenment, according to Ayn Rand, is that philosophers couldn't give a solution to the problem of induction. And it's both. They couldn't point out what was wrong with these kind of induction is circular arguments, and they couldn't give a positive account of inductive methods either. Second, when we're developing a positive, objective theory of induction, one of the things that has to be front and center is you have to emphasize just all of the mental activity that goes on it. It's not passive reception. It's not just you kind of look at the data and the categories write themselves on your mind and the generalizations pop up. There's more to science than rooting out errors. That's what Popper's on about. And here's just some examples. It's really interesting to me, at least, is this, I'll just highlight one thing since I'm almost out of time. There's this type of experiment that historians of science call exploratory experiments. And these are experiments that are aimed to generate questions. There's some poorly understood phenomenon like electromagnetism in the 19th century. And they're directed, it's like directed ignorance. Like, we know there's a thing here, electricity and magnetism. Let's play around with it and try to do that in such a way that we can conceptualize the domain. And part of the product of this is that a new vocabulary of concepts, but also new questions you can ask. So you can be active-minded and logical in coming up with questions and in coming up with concepts. And that's just not on the radar for the Popperians. Okay, let me skip that. So that's just, ask me in the questions for some more things that are worth working on if you're interested in the epistemology of science. I want to just close with this last point, that the defense of induction is the defense of science. So if science really is like induction par excellence, then the only way to defend science against its critics is to build a defense of induction. And that's a little negative, I think. It's like reactive. But it's important. I mean, if you were at your own talk the other day, the future doesn't look great. And one of the last bastions of reason in the world is in the STEM fields, the sciences. And their walls are pretty thin because all they have is Popper. So they need something better. Now that's, like I said, that's the kind of defensive. There's also the offensive. We know so little about the right methods of induction. I mean, Leonard Peikoff's book is good, it's just a start. And imagine how much more we could know and how much more quickly we could know if we actually fully understood the epistemology that goes into scientific theory generation. So I'll close on that positive, and I think we have 10 minutes for questions. You can line up over there. Hi, go ahead.
Hey, good morning.
Morning.
Maybe it's a little early for me this morning, but I couldn't quite follow the first refutation on Popper. I wonder if you could put the slide back on where.
Yeah, can we do that?
Where Popper goes into his hypotheses, because I was wondering. It said, yeah, okay.
Tell me when. Mm-hmm. Is it? You mean this? Where we go? This one?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
Because, for instance, I mean, what jumps out at me is he's using the word all in number 4. All principles of induction are arrived at inductively. How does he know? Well, this principle of induction does, and this principle of induction does, and this one.
Yeah.
And that's an induction then. So how can he use? He uses induction to refute induction.
Yeah,
and
this is a. Can we keep it up? Thanks. This is a kind of a reductio ad absurdum. That is, he's trying to argue that if you take certain things that inductivists accept, certain principles that so it's the inductivist that thinks this and this and this, then it leads to a contradiction, right?
Okay,
Circular reason is a kind of contradiction.
Okay.
So he's trying to say that their view has a self-contradiction. You can think of it that way.
I was on the wrong foot there.
Okay. But I mean, Popper is allowed to, on his own terms, say general things. He just thinks that you don't establish them inductively. Okay. So you come up with a general idea, all the chickens lay eggs, and if you try to falsify it and it passes the test, you can say, wow, it passed the test, so what we do is we accept the theories that haven't yet been refuted. It's kind of pragmatic, right? We just accept it. So he can say he can say things like all S is P, but it's just not you can't interpret it inductively for him.
All right.
Yeah. Hey.
My question is very similar to the previous question, but I wondered how did Popper supported his arguments, and then you said you start from the hypothesis and then you go on, so we can just take them out of his brain, he doesn't need to justify them?
So the premises in the argument I just had up, that's, like I was saying, that's like a reductio. So it's not really that Popper, it's Popper's attributing them to inductivism. So he's saying, if you're, so for those of us who are objectivists and like induction, he's saying, you guys believe these things. So Popper doesn't believe, he believes some of them, but he believes all principles of induction are generalizations. I'm sure he agrees with that. But he doesn't believe that all generalizations are arrived at inductively. We believe that, or allegedly we believe that.
So my question is, if I'm trying to enter his mind and view the world the way he views it, how can I falsify his theory? Like, did he ever talked about it? Like, because you can say to him, yeah, but look, there's inductive things that do work, so your theories are falsified. But then he would say, no, you just haven't discovered it.
So his view is not just that inductivism is wrong. It's that nobody actually thinks inductively. It's not that you guys think inductively and you're making a mistake. It's you're not actually doing that. What you're doing is something like falsificationism. You're putting things to the test. And putting things to the test could be like, well, Vadim told me he was out to lunch and I went to the restaurant and he wasn't there, so I don't trust what he says. He's lying to me about where he's going for lunch. That's like a test. I went and looked and checked on it, right? That's the kind of thing he thinks we do to get knowledge, and he thinks like that's what we do, not the inductive stuff.
And did he put his theory to the test somewhere in his books? Like,
well, that's a good question. How would you like rigorously test rigorous testing? That's like sociology of science. I mean, maybe you could do it. You could like look at papers that are falsificationist-y and see what kind of results they have versus papers that are like inductivist. I guess you could do it. I don't know if Popper ever tried to do that himself in any kind of systematic way. I mean, some of what Popper thinks is, his philosophy is called critical rationalism. So falsificationism is his view of science, but his broader view of knowledge is called critical rationalism. So there's some things that are just self-evidently true for him, like principles of principles of deduction. So you don't need to falsify that. It's true by a matter of reflective logic. So, yeah. So it's not that like literally every single thing needs to be falsified.
So you mentioned at the start, like reasons to think that a lot of working scientists today hold this view in some form or other.
Well, so what they hold is something they get from Popper, but it's not like, it's like Popper's bad, and what they hold is like a silly bad version of what's bad. Like, yeah.
Okay. So like beyond the fact that it means they're unable to defend science against its attackers, do you have any examples of cases where like it's making them do worse science?
Well, so the major one is particle physics. That's been an accusation for a long time. So there's a number of books on this. There's a couple from the aughts, Not Even Wrong. Now that's an interesting one because he says the theories aren't falsifiable, and also what they're doing is like coming up with ad hoc things. Sabine Hassenfeld, I always forget how to say her name. She has a book, I think it's called Lost in Math, where she's saying, and again, it's not like explicitly like let's discuss Popper, but it's like what they're doing is just coming up with new particles, just not because there's any evidence to suspect they exist, but just to fix a problem, and she's objecting to that as a method. There's some sociology and history of science research on how many papers on fundamental cutting-edge theory there are now versus in the past. And so it's like fundamental breakthroughs are at a sharp decline over the last like 50, 60 years. And
you think that's because of
whether you can say it's because they're all falsificationists, it's definitely because there's an abandonment of the old inductive way of thinking. Right. Now, how much of that is because people are Popperians or they're hypothetico-deductivists or whatever, that's a harder question to ask. But I do think it's because of just decline of inductive thinking. And different sciences, some sciences are worse than the others. From what I understand of particle physics, they're pretty bad. They're just kind of like speculating, whereas biology seems to be much better.
Thank you.
Returning to the Halley's Comet example, part of what you were saying, were you saying that the observation of Halley's Comet, in fact, confirmed Newton's theory?
I wasn't saying either way. I was just like, what is your reaction to that? Because I think a reasonable reaction is, when a really surprising prediction of a new theory comes true, like it's a natural reaction to think, like, yeah, that's more likely to be that theory is more likely to be right. But that's not how to think about it if you're a falsificationist. That hasn't been, it passed a difficult test, and usually that means it's the only one that passed that test. So it's the best we have. Can you say it's true? It's more true than the one that didn't pass the test, I guess.
Yeah, you can only ever prove it wrong.
Yeah, you can only ever prove it wrong. And if you want to get into like really deep Popper, there's strange ideas. There's something called verisimilitude, which is like truthiness likeness. So it's like the theory is more truthy, but it's not true. Yeah. So is that? Okay. Hey.
Hey, thanks for the talk. To what extent do you think a lack of a full objectivist account on the theory of induction posits a problem to a man-in-the-street objectivist insofar as that exists? Or to put it the same question in another way, do you think the objectivist account of inductive thinking as presented in ITOE and OPAR is enough for like a philosophy for Reardon sort of objectivist and like let philosophers of science like bother with the full theory of induction, or do you think the problem is more grave? Thanks.
So that's an interesting question, because we talk about philosophy for Reardon versus philosophy for Ragnar. If you're not familiar with that, like the idea is Ragnar is an actual philosopher, so there's certain questions Ragnar has that Reardon doesn't. But Reardon's also a research scientist. Right? So, like, if you include practicing scientists, and there's a lot of objectivists who are, engineers count. Like, now I don't just mean like theorists, like engineers, people in tech, like inventing new technologies, working on, like all of that. I think here's what I think would benefit people in that class. It's in that group. A epistemology-heavy history of science, particularly history of their own industry. So you could see, like, here's how my predecessors solved the difficult problems that they were facing, and here's the epistemological issue. And like, to say what the epistemological issues are, you have to have a good epistemology, and we have some of what we need, but I don't think we have enough. So ITOE has a theory of concepts. It doesn't have a theory of induction. You get the beginnings of that from Leonard Peikoff, and like I said, a lot of that's really great. I think some of it's too incomplete to be helpful. So one of the important questions I think to think about for epistemologists of science is how to understand historical episodes of theory change. So like the shift from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics, and
paradigm shifts.
Sorry?
Paradigm shifts, right?
Yeah, they're called paradigm shifts, but I don't like that way of thinking about it. But yeah, that's what they're called, and like how to epistemologically how to understand that. And what we have is the beginnings of an answer to that through the kind of blood type examples that Dr. Peikoff uses in OPAR, and Jim Lennox has a good paper on this in Concepts and Their Role in Knowledge. Is that where it is, Jim? Yeah, so Jim's worked on that a little. But I think that part of like doing this project of coming up with an objective theory of induction is you have to think a lot about how science grows, including revising its own ontology, like theory of what exists in the physics, in the science you're doing. So I've got the signal that we're out of time. So thanks, everyone.